that interesting presentation from Dr. Shepard Fungura on growing the Zimbabwe insurance industry, and of course, that insightful discussion around impact of climate change and what have you. And I think the call that was coming through there was that the risks are going up that way, so really the premiums should be going the same direction. So we're going to start off topic number 6. This is being presented by Ms. Maya Nundo Andre. You remember I jumped on her to make a presentation or a view with regards the Mauritius market. We're honored to have her. Very well acclaimed lady, I mean a lawyer, a broker, and all sorts of things, and an accomplished trainer. The topic is building the workforce for the future in insurance. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Ms. Maya Andre to come through. Let's give her a big hand.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's really a privilege standing here today in front of all of you. And I'm really very honored to be with people from Zimbabwe and many of friends, colleagues who have been from other countries accompanying us today here. And I would like to thank, first of all, IRZ, the General Manager, the President, Madam the Commissioner, board members, the audience, and all who made this event possible today. Zimbabwe, I would say, is not stranger to Mauritians at all. We have many Zimbabwe people working in the insurance sector already in Mauritius. And we really admire, appreciate the effort, the hard working in that sector. Myself, at Munich Re, at Reinsurance Solutions, even at Swan Insurance Company in Mauritius, I have worked many of you and of the Zimbabwe professionals, and we have learned a lot from you. So today, if I'm here, I would say I'm just adding to part of what you already know. So the topic that I have chosen, you can all see, it's building the workforce for the future in insurance. I think all this time we've been talking about climate change, technology, machine learning, cyber risk, emerging risk. But what we will reach there eventually, but how do we reach there? This is very important. Some of you have already got into it, but others, there are new strategies, new ways of thinking, how to attract people into this sector, first of all, because I'm sure if I ask the question here with the audience, how many came into this industry by choice? Can we count? Maybe someone can, if you can raise your hands, is it by choice or by coincidence? Or when you arrive, when you reach this industry, then you realize, yeah, this is really wide and we want to stay. So it is amazing that I have myself come across people who just came to spend maybe a year as internship in our company when they discovered not only insurance, but reinsurance, how wide it is and how much they are learning and how passionate they became. They asked me if they can stay. So what are we doing in this industry? I think we are not as visible as the banking sector and even other professionals. So we would like here to mention that there is, on top of tackling the climate issues, the emerging risks, we also have to make it attractive for people to join this industry and contribute and come up with those new products that are much awaited by the insurance sector now. The spotlight is on us. If you look at COP26, if you look at all those summits where it's organized, you will see that insurance has to play a very important role in the coming years, not only in the specific countries, collaboration with governments, collaboration with other organizations in putting our expertise to other organizations so that together we can contribute to the good of all the companies. So without delaying further, so these are this is the agenda, the evolving, I don't know if it is working properly. There a problem with it? Here you are. So the introduction, the evolving role of insurance and the need for a future-ready workforce. As I said, a future-ready workforce. We all know insurance has changed. The expectation is changing each and every day. What it used to be in the past, it's no longer there. On a daily basis, I can tell you, being a reinsurance broker, the type of risk that comes to us sometimes really surprises us. So we have to be ready to face these challenges and to meet the client expectation. Then we'll talk about how to adapt to the technological changes. Learning and development. I think Zimbabwe here, you are very much quite advanced with the IIZ, and also I understand with the contribution of the insurance institutes. Thank you. So, learning and development. I think we all know in this industry we have to be prepared. It's only learning and development that will help our workforce come up with the products that are required for the society. And then attracting and retaining the young talent in the industry. This is really a very big work that is expected from us being in this industry. Because as I mentioned earlier, how did we find ourselves into this industry? Today, when you look around you, are you really finding the people who are interested to join the industry? I think if we are doing proper work about encouraging, being more visible, then there will be some interest. And we'll cover this as well. Strengthening local expertise in Africa. There's a lot of expertise in our industry. In all these countries, more than 52 countries in Africa, each one with its own culture, with its own expertise. I think there's a lot that can be done. And unfortunately, very often it's happening that we are working a bit in isolation and not really getting to know more about what's happening on the other side. Promoting leadership, diversity, and inclusivity. How do we get prepared for all this? And we'll cover this one as well. Encouraging collaboration across borders. So again, how do we learn from others? How do we learn from the expertise, the specialty, get the products that others are selling, and kind of learn from them? So insurance is undergoing transformative changes driven by technological advances, shifting client expectations, regulatory changes, and a complex global risk environment. As I mentioned earlier, things are changing so fast, the landscape is changing so quick that we have to be prepared. Our workforce thought process should be really kind of the critical, analytical way, should be really at another level so that we come up with that product that is much demanded. So these changes impact traditional business models and create new risk categories. When we talk about business models itself, without talking business models, let's talk about our models. If you look at the catastrophe models that the property people have been using for rating business for all these years, do you think we can still rely on it? Does it truly reflect what is happening in the world now with the climate changes, with the new challenges that we are facing? So there is a need for insurers to expand their focus beyond risk transfer to become more active partners in risk prevention, resilience building, and societal stability. So how do we do that? So insurers are evolving from simply offering financial protection to becoming active partners in risk prevention, resilience building, and societal stability. And this transformation reflects a shift in the role of insurance from reactive to proactive, aimed at reducing vulnerabilities and supporting sustainable, resilient communities. So, for example, proactive risk prevention through Internet of Things, telematics, and predictive analytics, insurers now offer real-time risk assessment and prevention services. In some countries, it's happening already. As far as I understood, in South Africa, I was in Joburg last month, and we had some discussion on it. Telematics in motor insurance, this is something which is happening. Whether it is acceptable to a lot or not, it is, but it is a reality. So it is for monitoring the driving behaviors. Many countries in Africa, even Mauritius, I would say we are far from it, but it is in demand. In property insurance, Internet of Things sensors can detect fire, flood, or structural issues early, allowing prompt intervention. So loss prevention advisory services. Today, the role of insurers have changed. Instead of only meeting claims, we have to advise our client, okay? And this is one of my advice, in fact, that this is where we really add value. This is long-term partnership. When we are giving advice, we are building a book together with the insured. It's a chain, okay? Risk mitigating factors, analyzing risk together, advising on them, and coming up with a very long-term partnership. Specialized consulting, offering guidance as cybersecurity, reducing likelihood of claims. And this is what clients want from us today. Instead of being, they have to know from where we are coming. The more mitigating factors we are talking about, they will understand from which point are we coming. We are not here only to pay claims. And this mindset has to be the actual mindset. Education and awareness programs run public awareness campaigns on cybersecurity, for example, for small business or climate resilience for homeowners. For example, homeowners, now if you see, there are new types of materials being used in some areas where there has been very bad claims and the homes were not as resilient as expected. So building resilience across industries and communities. Insurers creating products specifically designed to strengthen resilience, such as policies that include funding for resilient building after natural disasters or coverage fee. Business continuity planning, okay, so that they can keep on doing business even after the disasters. These products encourage customers to take proactive steps to protect themselves and recover more effectively after a loss. And partnership for community resilience. Insurers collaborate with government, as I mentioned. Insurers have large set of data, okay? And we have the responsibility to take care of these data. One question when I would even ask here, we are responsible for clients' data. We are responsible for our own data. When we hold that much amount of information for clients, what about cyber? I've been taking this example because if you look at cyber, it's kind of a no-go in many places because it is still complex, too much information requirement. The policy wording is not the right policy wording. We are just taking from other places and to copy it in African context. So is it the right measure? But then ignoring cyber is really not the best thing to do. We are all exposed to it. What if we are ourselves, our insurers, hit by a cyber claim? What image? What will that be in front of our clients itself? Do you know that even as directors, we have the responsibility to take enough measures so that we are eliminating and mitigating cyber risks in our own organization? So it starts from inside the organization. Board members have the responsibility. And tomorrow it can even trigger your own professional indemnity because, the DNO, not the professional indemnity. Because shareholders can ask directors why there were not enough measures taken really to cater for cyber exposure. So how we respond to these forces will shape the future of insurance, and that response starts with our people. Adapting to technological changes. Are we ready? Not that much, I would say. There are things are happening so quick. So equipping our workforce with the digital skills and technological fluency they need to succeed. How quick can that happen? There has been quite some worries about whether they will be able to really meet what is required from them. There has been some concern about people, the fear about losing their job because they won't be able to meet the requirement. So technical training, invest in training programs that equip employees with skills in data analytics, AI, and machine learning. Cybersecurity skills, as I mentioned earlier, become more well-versed with the requirement for cyber and having the mindset, which all should be ready for fostering a digital-first mindset across the organization. So developing a culture of lifelong learning. Learning doesn't stop at IIZ exams or CII exams. It's a lifelong learning, as we say. So risk regulation and technologies are fast evolving, and so must our people. So if on top of these requirements about exams, if we are not up to date with what's going on worldwide and what is happening in this and this country, and you are not learning really from these spaces, then really there is, our studies just get wasted, outdated. We are quickly outdated. Tomorrow morning, if I do not read about reinsurance news, about Atlas magazine, give us all information from Africa, I'm outdated the day after. So professional development pathways, clear pathways for continuous learning, offering training that aligns with both company goals and personal career developments. Encourage cross-functional skills, combining knowledge of underwriting with digital analytics or marketing insights. So this has to work like that. On the job learning, mentorship programs, and rotational assignments, even rotational assignments, I have seen this has worked very well. People being, if they are interested, being shifted to the claims department or even going to another branch and learn about the culture and the demand of another place. That is very fruitful for the staff. So attracting and retaining young talent, as I have mentioned earlier, there's a need for the vision and energy of young professionals. How do we attract them in our industry? Promoting the purpose of insurance. When we were talking about insurance, why when you look at accountants, actuaries, engineers, architects, they very proudly say they are chartered. Are we not chartered? Do we have chartered status? We have fellows, associates in our industry, but we never talk about it. We have to pride ourselves of being to that level. So, but this is what the public, the audience know. This will bring much more. This will bring much more trust into our. Excuse me. There's a. Hopefully it's good now. Oh. So attracting young talent, offer flexible career path. This is what young people like today. They need that career path, flexible work arrangements, like exposure to different roles, internship, apprenticeship, graduate. This is where they understand what's going on the insurance side, and they can stay in the industry. Create diverse and inclusive workplaces, attract a broader range of candidates, and foster a supportive environment for all. Foster a culture of innovation and agility. So strengthening local expertise in Africa. I said it earlier, the insurance needs in Africa are unique. Local training programs, collaboration with African universities and vocational schools to develop specialized insurance programs. And this, I can proudly say again that in Zimbabwe, you have developed their own COP, but of course, it is expected that you develop other levels of programs, continuous education on emerging topics, regional partnership, form partnership with local institutions to offer internships, apprenticeship, and mentorship programs. Collaborating with international insurers and reinsurers, we get to know the new products that are being working well in other places, how to improve our staff expertise in these matters, investing in capacity building and local research, encourage teams to come up with new products, working in groups together so that they cater for the needs of Africa, knowledge exchange with other emerging markets, so creating a platform where we can exchange these knowledge. So invest in rural and community-based expertise, building teams that reflect Africa's diversity. We should be proudly saying they have so many cultures, and this is where we can really give the example of diversity. We are better positioned to create products that genuinely serve all regions. So promoting leadership, diversity, and inclusivity. There is a need for a diverse leadership team for innovative thinking and strategic resilience. Develop diverse talent pipelines. Make leadership development a priority for women, young professionals, and people from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. And it reminds me of yesterday, Women in Insurance. So this is a very good initiative. The intention here is not to isolate women from men. The idea is to encourage women to come at the forefront, and really they have the capability to really take leadership roles. Empower emerging leaders, create opportunities for young and emerging professionals to take on leadership roles early in their careers. When you see young people having that aspiration, this is detected very early, and this should be encouraged in that path. foster inclusive decision-making, encourage leaders to consider a broad range of perspectives, ensuring decisions reflect the needs of the communities we serve. So encouraging collaboration across borders. It's a bit a repetition, but I think we have to stress on it. Collaborating across borders helps us share best practices and build regional resilience. Regional knowledge sharing platforms. Insurance professionals from across Africa can exchange insights on regulatory trends, technology, and consumer behaviors. What is expected from consumers? Consumers are very much protected in all around the world. So we have to be there, present for our customers, be there, listening to their needs. So, because if there are legal issues, customers are heard first, isn't it? Disaster risk pooling, allowing insurers to pool resources for shared risks, reducing financial burdens and strengthening resilience. So here it also helps into spread of risk. So that is also because very often we do not have the capacity to really cater for some very special line of business, or insurers do not have it in their treaty programs. So this is where that kind of encouraging insurers to pool resources from shared risks is really important. Collaboration with international partners, access global expertise, emerging trends, and innovative practices which can be adapted to meet local needs. So building the insurance workforce of the future is a shared responsibility. We have to take the decision now, the steps we take today, embracing technology, fostering continuous learning, building local expertise, promoting diversity and collaborating are all essential for building a workforce that is resilient, adaptable, and equipped to navigate a fast-changing landscape. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much. You may be seated. All right. My friends are still to bring me a cordless, so I got to deal with this one. Insightful presentation with regards what we're really needing to do. I liked the aspect that she highlighted that talked specifically about promoting young talent. This is not in any way, I know something was mentioned yesterday about the 80s, 90s fellows. We're not being sidelined, but we are wanting to promote young talent. Any comments or contributions from the floor that we can look at? Because I think it's a serious issue. It's an issue. We were having a discussion yesterday on the fact relating to the lack of technical skills or the lack of continuous development, as it were, in the industry. And I think what Maya has highlighted resonates with that. Can we have any comments from the floor?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Maya, I think, for that presentation, quite insightful. Yeah, it's very true. I'm sure the problem is to do with the young generation, the young talent, developing them. I'm sure from where we stand, the issue is to say they come, they don't stay. They're always everywhere. So I'm sure we really need a strategy for us to be able to make them stay. I think it's important probably as we also age, and like you've rightfully say, our industry really needs technical expertise. But the problem is we want to develop with the young talents. The young talents are coming, they are going, they are not staying in the employment. What more can we do to make sure that they stay within the organization so that we can then be able to develop the talent? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. I think it concerns all of us. young people are not informed enough about insurance and the reinsurance world. As I mentioned, they discover insurance only when they join the industry or they came here as interns. And when they discover that reinsurance is as wide as is, most often they are staying. But the thing is that if we offer clear pathways, if we show to them that there is really their future into it, that clear pathway will definitely give them an interest into staying into the industry and showing, even today, it has become much more interesting because actuaries, data analytics, what is needed is more than risk assessment based on statistics that we see in front of us. So that analytical mind, people want to see other things than just assessing the risk, which becomes boring at some point in time. So technology can really attract them, and also based on different roles, they can also have the choice of doing insurance, reinsurance claims, so rotational roles also will help them. And also the people in country-wise, insurance awareness should be shown a bit more in society, in creating stability for society itself, and the role insurance is playing globally, especially after COVID. If you look at what happened and how much insurers acted very quickly in situations of chaotic situation, and I think from there we just remain silent. How are we really then telling that, okay, from there insurance has changed? We talk to clients, we talk to people about insurance, but compulsory insurance, the wide range of talents needed today to come to emerging risk, this is what should be shown, that we need them to come and analyze and help us in coming up with those innovative products.
Interesting. So, Maya, you may not be familiar with this, but in Zimbabwe, because of certain positions in terms of the economy, you find that the young people, as a generalized statement, are dealers. They want to make money now. If they join you, they want to be the CEO now. You guys experiencing that? So we've got into a situation where they are not seeing a career approach like some of us were schooled to go into. We may have different thinkings now, but anyway. How do you deal with that? Is that a problem that can be looked at on an industry perspective, or would you assess it and call it more of a national problem, where the young talent, they get out of school, they get out of varsity, and they want to make a quick buck now? I mean, what would be your suggestions around that? I don't know if I'm coming across clearly.
The suggestion would be come up with research programs where you can come up with very innovative products that is needed in the country. Okay? If you say here agriculture, for example, and mining, no, there are some minerals, some, but a lot. And if they get into research programs that can really put them into roles about getting really those innovative products that can meet the society's needs, that would be already something that should be encouraged. So working in teams and encouraging, developing that mindset, critical mindset, analytical, having this data, and really see what is the need based on the statistics that insurers have, reinsurers have. We can come up with many more that can be fruitful in the near future. So that would be my encouragement.
Super. No, thank you very much. Board Member Dorcas Chiwuta, if you don't mind, I'm calling on you just to come to the front to assist us with the presentation. I think, a very insightful discussion, and one that affects many CEOs or heads of institutions with regards the aspect of retaining staff. We heard how one particular company in Zim is being affected by the fact that their office has become a training ground. And, you know, they're losing staff. Come close to a treaty arrangement, they've lost all the staff because they've just been trained and the guys have moved on. Anyway, please accept our small token of appreciation for the lovely presentation. Super. No, thank you very much. The next topic, fire. How rapidly your friend can become your enemy. This is a very interesting presentation as well that's coming through from Johan van der Heever. He's with EFI Global Regional, and I think this is part of the Sedgwick Group, is it? Yep. So quite an interesting discussion that's coming up, particularly around fire issues. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together, Johan van der Heever.
Good morning, everybody. I say you must always take that one thing away from the previous speaker's presentation to help you ease yourself into your presentation. So the one thing that I took away from Maya's presentation was that slide where she said, embrace technology. And it came with a nice turquoise green color, which reminded me of the seawater color in Mauritius. But embrace technology. So I'm legendary for going over my time. So I'm embracing technology today by keeping a stopwatch. And I'll see if I can manage to stay within my time. So thank you for that one, Maya. Yes, so my name is Johan van der Heever. I'm with EFI Global. We are wholly owned part of Sedgwick globally, internationally. And you know, I've spoken about this topic on many occasions before, and today I thought to myself, or for this preparation, for such an esteemed audience like yourselves, how will I give it a new angle, or how will I come with a new approach? So one evening I was waking up early hours of the morning, and the thought came to my mind to say, but how quickly can our best friend, this thing, fire, is actually one of our best friends. How quickly does our best friend become our worst enemy? So a couple examples is we use fire for cooking. We saw last night at the Boma how nice the meat was being cooked. We use fire for heating. It's cold in winter, we make fireplaces. It's our friend, it warms us up. A lot of you here will be familiar with the romance that happens at the candle. So we use a fire or a flame for romantics. But I think I want to call this presentation specifically on calling fire our enemy. So I'm going to analyze this enemy, and I'm going to take a few different looks at what this enemy does and how quickly it can actually become an enemy. So I need to move on. Right, so part of Sedgwick, we are actually functioning as a risk management company, but we use forensics in risk management to cross-sell 4 of our main service offerings, which is fire and explosion investigations, specialty consulting, environmental specialist services, and forensic engineering. And you'll quickly see after this presentation, why those 4 products are part of my stable. And I also want to ask you, or ask somebody in the audience just to remind me, when it's question session, ask me the question as to how not to conduct a fire investigation. So somebody must remember to ask that question. All right, so I'm quickly going to run through my program for today. Is our enemy predictable or unpredictable? Where is this enemy hiding? It can even be in this room. That's why we've got a detection system. That's why we've got sprinklers. There's cabling. There's combustibles in this room. What power does this enemy actually have? What is this enemy called fire? How does this enemy operate? What does it look like? How can we unmask this enemy? Is there anything that we can take back, which the enemy robs from us? Can we beat this enemy? Can we learn from this enemy? All right, so I just want to take you quickly through the first video clip. This is a demonstration where an education around this enemy is happening, but let's see how predictable or unpredictable the enemy can be. So the person is too close to the fire, né? So as you can see, this unpredictability of fire. I can talk 25 minutes just on that one video clip. Sorry for that. But there was human elements involved. There was the accelerant that was used to set the combustibles alight. And there was a relationship that happened over there that when the ignition source got ignited, everything got out of control. Then from the fright that the person got, he just threw the petrol because in his mind he says, I need to get it away from me. I need to get it away from me. And then actually spread the fire. So it's very unpredictable, this enemy that we've got. The enemy is old. Ken McLean was in London not too long ago, visiting our head office over there, and came across this park, and he took a photograph. This is where the big fire of London started in 1666. More or less where this plaque is. And it happened in Pudding Lane, of all places. And it is the King's Baker who started the big fire of London. And I have it on good authority, and I think this room will tell me that this is where insurance was born. And I'm not sure. Yeah, there we go. The enemy can be hiding in a laundry basket. So here you see the lady taking the laundry out of the tumble dryer. It's a laundromat. She puts the basket, bottom picture here, she puts the basket down, she walks, she checks the other baskets. They close business. Look at the time there. At 22:15, the whole laundromat is filled with smoke. At 22:19, as you can see over there, there's flames in the middle of the photograph on the right. At 22:51, you've got a flaming fire that has been established. There it spreads to the rest of the laundry that was on the table next to where she put the basket. The fire was hiding in that laundry basket. Yeah, we've got our kitchens. We're familiar with our kitchens at home. But you'll tell me, but hang on, that picture on the right, the stove. There's nothing wrong on the stove. Normally we think, hey, the stove. The things go wrong when you cook on the stove. Yeah, on this particular instance, it was a fire that we recently investigated. The dishwasher, actually right next to that fridge, the fire started in that dishwasher. I was fortunate enough to conduct this fire investigation in Northern Ireland. I was overseas last year with a EFI Global regional meeting, and the call came on a Wednesday for a fire investigation, and I raised my hand before I could think twice, and there we go, off we go. So we go to this, also a kitchen fire. Here you can see the stove is in the middle of where we say most burning has happened. In this particular instance, what happened here was the person who submitted the claim said they bought an air fryer and they used it for the first time, and the air fryer set the kitchen alight. So in our minds and in insurers' minds, we were thinking, okay, here's a good potential for recovery. If there's something wrong with this air fryer, there's going to be issues that we can deal with. So this is what we found. The big photograph is what we found. We had to do some excavations, and we did some reconstruction. So the top photograph, you can see we reconstructed the ignition sequence, we call it. The bottom photograph. So what happened is the father was on cooking duty that evening, and there was a lot of children running around there, small children, and we actually had to step over all the toys. And I realized the household is somewhat in disorganizement. Things are all over the show. So what he did was he put the chicken and the vegetables in the air fryer, and he put it on the gas stove. But on the back rear plate of the gas stove, he had a pot with potatoes boiling. So he actually put the air fryer too close to the gas flame. And after we've reconstructed the ignition sequence and we showed him what happened, he then realized, okay, this is actually how that fire happened. Fires can hide in our cooling fans. I mean, if you look at this one, there's a small sewing business. The fan in the foreground that you see over here, they were using it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but it stopped turning. The blades stopped turning. So they were fiddling with it, fiddling, tried to fix it. But then it became home time. As you can see from the timestamps, I don't know how clear that is. 3 o'clock in the morning, this fire broke out from that fan. So in other words, the motor was still trying to turn the fan, but the blades were stuck. And the motor then built up heat over a prolonged period. It built up heat. And as you can see from the CCTV footage there, the heat transferred to the housing of the fan. And we have an ignition that happened, yeah, and then an established fire. So the enemy can even hide in the cooling fan. Printing presses. There's a lot of these fires that we are investigating all over. These machines, they are big. They print 500 meters per minute of printing material, predominantly for the food industry. You're talking huge plant and machinery using ink and solvents and so forth. Boilers. You know that person there, the boiler operator? According to that camera 5, 2 seconds before that boiler exploded, he was standing in front of that boiler. And he moved away to the left, and that boiler exploded. We investigated this boiler explosion to do the root cause of the reason why it behaved like that. The enemy takes from us. Here's Lux Belmar Resort in Mauritius. That used to be the entertainment area, the restaurants area, the pool area. It all burned down. The photograph on the right is actually to the left of that area, that circular area that you see there. So the wind was a major factor on that day, and it took that fire throughout the whole premises. This was, I think Maya might also vouch, this was, and Ken was a leading executive loss adjuster on this claim. would confirm that this is the biggest fire that Mauritius has had in their history. 800 million rand, I think it was 46 million dollars. You see, I'm also battling with this dollar thing. In South Africa, this fire happened in the beginning of this year. Also, it took the entire property. Under windy conditions, started on the one side, the wind blew right across. This is a 200 million rand claim. It can be hiding in a chimney. We love thatch. We have fireplaces. We've got chimneys. So if you look at the photograph in the middle, it's the chimney. The yellow dotted lines is the chimney in the lounge area. The red dotted lines is the fireplace and the chimney in the bedroom next door. But both of those flues come up into the chimney stack, single chimney stack. But if you look at the photos on the right, those roof trusses of that thatch roof actually penetrate the chimney stack. So over time, you make fires, and if you make fires in both fireplaces, the amount of convectional heat that's going up that chimney set fire to the roof trusses that was actually built into the chimney flue or the chimney space. Talking about bushfires, forest, bush fires. Here you can see we use satellite mapping, and we've got access to 5 satellites that we currently are using to draw these fire scars. On the bottom right, you'll see the yellow dot. Just back to the photograph here, you'll see the big red area, then you'll see the 2 smaller areas. And the yellow dot is in the middle one of the 2 smaller ones, or on the left. And that fire top right is the fire that was happening where that yellow dot is. So the wind was blowing from top from north to south on this photograph. And from the strength of the wind, it was burning brands. We call it burning brands or embers. And as you can see, the enemy is very selective. It picks the building with thatch. The other buildings, they are standing. The one with thatch, towering inferno, right there. And we love thatch, eh? The enemy is hiding in our shops. It's hiding in our heavy commercial vehicles. It's hiding in our factories. It's hiding in our mines. This was a spontaneous combustion fire investigation that I worked on for Ken McLean. It is a mine in South Africa, a coal mine. And as you know, coal has got the ability, when it gets into oxygen, it gives off heat, and you have a spontaneous fire that happened. This is thermal imaging. We've embraced technology, by the way. We do some thermal imaging sometimes. But it's very interesting to see the signature of the heat in the stacks. Okay, I need to stop my stopwatch now. Okay, our theaters. This is a theater that in Cape Town. So even where we go for entertainment, this is a fire that happened under the stage. This is a fire that happened at the Cordon Barclay Wharf building in Mauritius. It's in our shopping centers, in our shopping malls. It is in our storerooms. This is a small outlet, and there was a fire that happened on the other side of that steel door. But by conduction, the heat conducted through the steel door and started burning the stock that the retailer was keeping on this side. Even in our cold rooms, composite panels. I'm sure that cold rooms is something that you've come across on many occasions. It is where you've got the core material, either polyurethane or polystyrene. You've got the 2 outer metal layers, either aluminium or stainless steel. It's good for thermal insulation, it's good for cold rooms, it's good for soundproofing, it's good for clean clinical environments. But if you start looking at the top of the cold room, if you walk on the roof, even if it's in a building where there's a sprinkler system, and as you can see, this cold room has got stainless steel outer metal. And remember, metal is a good conductor. So even with the sprinkler in the building and with a lot of cabling that actually penetrates the core material, you can have this happening. So on this occasion, the polystyrene caught alight. It burned the photographs that you see there. They do sleeve the cabling that goes through between the outer layers of the composite panel through the inner layer. But we found one location, as you can see where the blue arrows are, where that arc occurred. So when the cold room starts up, there's vibration. When the evaporator inside the cold room starts up, there's vibration. When it switches off, there's vibration. Over time, there's loss of insulation between the conductor and the sharp edges of the hole that was drilled through. And there was a notch, we call it a notch, where there was a point of arc that happened, and it set the cold room alight. Our chemicals. This is a sad one for me because you'll see now what happened here. Listen to the term, river of fire. Look how that fire spreads on top of the water. As far as the water goes, the fire goes, eh? Look at the other exposures there. Also, more tanks, more storage vessels. So who or what is this enemy called fire? All right. So now we need to start learning about this enemy. It's a rapid oxidation process, which is a chemical chain reaction that results in the evolution of light and heat. So you'll see now that from the video footage, there was a lot of smoke. But smoke is not in the definition of a fire, light and heat. So you'll ask me later, why is smoke not in the definition? All right. Fire dynamics is the study of the behavior of fire. How does this fire behave? How will a fire behave in this room? How will it behave in a cold room? How will it behave in a chemical plant? We see that for ourselves. We have a lot of definitions that we use in documenting fires, fire area, but your fire area is that distinguishable outer perimeter where you see the end of the fire effects. Everything within the fire effects is what we will be focusing on. So an expert forensic fire investigator will document all of these, as well as the impact of ventilation. On a fire incident, the distribution and type of flammables and combustibles involved, as well as the fire spread path. We often look for the ignition source. We want to know if the ignition source is competent. But the material that it ignited, was that material competent to be ignited? That's the other verse 2 of the question. Sometimes we forget verse 2. So how does this enemy operate? Very easy, very simple. We need to do some chemistry to understand this one. The triangle of combustion. You've got 3 legs or 3 sides. Oxygen, you need oxygen. So we've got oxygen in this room. Eh? You need a fuel, anything that can burn, flammable, combustible. And you need a heat source. In the middle of that triangle, you'll see there's flames. So there's a reaction that happens between those 3 elements. Very simple aspect to a message that we can transfer for anybody to understand. We call it the triangle of combustion, but then there's also the tetrahedron of combustion because our enemy has also got some sophistication. So there again, you see the oxygen, the heat, the fuel, the chain reaction. So the chain reaction is on the right-hand side, bottom definition. I hope it's nice and clear that you can see it. Sufficient heat will cause fuel and oxygen to form free radicals and initiate self-sustained chemical reaction. So ignition has to be successful. You can have a situation where an ignition source in contact with the combustible, but the ignition source is not capable of transferring enough heat energy to that combustible. Or the ignition source loses its energy or dies out and there's no fire. Next morning they open the offices, they say, oh, we had a small fire in our building. They didn't know. All right? Or the chemical chain reaction is so sustainable that the ignition source does its work. It triggers the chemical chain reaction. It is no longer needed, but the chemical chain reaction continues, and you have the big robbery that the enemy has taken from us. So how does the enemy launch an attack? Very simple. By ignition. Ignition is temperature and time dependent. So temperature, there has to be enough heat energy over a period of time. So the two needs to be in contact with each other for long enough for a fire to break out. There's some interesting sources of heat on that list there. Mechanical heat, friction. We see a lot of this in the mining industry with conveyor belts and idlers. We see biological heat being generated. We see chemical heat, polymerization of fatty acids is an example there. We see bacterial breakdown of organic materials, electrical heat when there's loose connections or overcurrent or the resistance at a loose point where there's resistance heating happening at a poor connection. Okay, it wants me to talk to you about the graph there on the bottom. Okay, we'll get back to that. There are some more strategies that the enemy has. Self-heating. There's a lot of definitions here. Exothermic reactions, spontaneous ignition. There's differences between those definitions. It might sound to you like it's the same thing, but there are actually very specific differences. An exothermic reaction is where two incompatible substances, the one is an energizer or oxidizer, the other one is a hydrocarbon fuel source, and the two are not compatible. They react and they give off heat. It's an exothermic reaction, and you've got ignition. The speed of the enemy. Short video clip, but look at the stopwatch on the bottom right-hand side of the video. It's festive season coming up. A lot of people have celebrations like this. Look at the stopwatch and look at the speed of this enemy. Ignition at the bottom of the tree there. This is a pine tree. We call that a ceiling jet. And that can also be very perfect fire pattern that it forms. Look at the heat layer that it builds under the ceiling. Look at the furniture in the room, the smoke and the steam coming off the furniture, even the smoke and steam coming off the carpet. Look at the carpet there. Eventually the carpet starts burning. You see there. So that's what we call flashover. Look at the time, 35 seconds. We call that flashover in a normal room, sitting room. So one of the facts about the enemy, we need to understand a little bit of thermodynamics if we want to understand our enemy. But let's call that one we've just looked at, a fire in a room becoming a room on fire. Remember you saw the small flame under the tree? Eventually the whole room is on fire. So that's what we call flashover. NFPA 921 is a document that we use as a guide for fire and explosion investigations. They've got these illustrations. There's the chair. You can see the heat building up into the corner. You can see the heat layer developing under the ceiling, and there's radiation heat being imposed on the other combustibles in that room. And it then raises the temperature of those other combustibles to their auto-ignition temperature. So it's not that somebody took a flame to those items. They were just heated by the radiation heat coming off the ceiling. So in a fire investigation, forensic investigation, you need to understand how this has happened. The chair has burnt, but it doesn't mean the fire started at the chair in the middle of the room. It potentially started at the chair in the corner or the table. Some vulnerable targets. We have a lot of chemicals. Everyday chemicals that we have let's maybe go to that somewhere straight away. We've got petrol, gasoline, we've got diesel, we're all familiar with those two, propane, hydrogen. So we've got what we call a lower explosive limit and the upper explosive limit for each and every volatile, flammable substance out there, a liquid. So when it is at room temperature, it gives off enough vapor that there's enough particles of that material present with the oxygen in the room that when there's an ignition source that is capable of transferring the energy to that vapor cloud, you'll have an ignition, you'll have a flash fire. So there's easy targets. The enemy looks for easy targets. Look at the range for hydrogen, the top one, from 4% per volume to 75%. That's hydrogen. Diesel, look at diesel, 0.6% to 5.5%. But diesel is not as dangerous as petrol. Look at petrol, 1% to 7.6%. So if I take petrol and I throw it out on the floor here, you'll smell it. All right? If I take diesel, you won't smell it as fast as petrol, but you'll also smell it. Now the difference is the flash point of the two substances. But the petrol, the second one from the bottom, only starts at 1% of volume. In other words, 1% of particles of petrol to air in the room. 1 to 7.6%, that's its flammable range. More than 7.6% is too rich. It won't catch fire. So the flash point of a flammable substance is where the enemy's firepower comes in. Petrol is minus 43 degrees. So at minus 43 degrees at the South Pole, if I go to the South Pole now and I pour petrol there and it's minus 43, I put an ignition source, it will burn. If I do it here in this room, it will also burn. Okay, here is where people put water on a deep fryer. So you can see the flaming ignition when water gets put onto the oil. Look at that. And now it turns a very localized fire into an uncontrolled fire under the canopy. Right, I'm going to move on quickly. My time is running out. The enemy's movements. How does this enemy move? Radiation, convection, conduction. The enemy leaves footprints, fire patterns in buildings. So a fire forensic investigator must interpret and understand the fire patterns. The fire patterns reveals a lot of secrets that the enemy has left behind and where it started and where it ended. The speed of a fire, these people were working in the building. The fire broke out on the one side and they were not able to outrun the smoke. We'll see now. See how fast that smoke moves through that building. Okay, so what does an aggressive enemy look like? Mr. Master of Ceremonies, I've got a 2-minute video. Okay. So an aggressive enemy is like this. It's a sudden conversion of potential energy, chemical or mechanical, that gets turned into kinetic energy. In other words, it has the potential to do work. And that's when it breaks and shatters confined things like buildings or tanks. We call it high order damage. There can be a lot of missiles.
When a tank is exposed to sustained heat, such as from a fire, the liquid within the tank is forced to boil or vaporize, resulting in increased pressure in the tank. To prevent overstressing the tank, the relief device activates, venting the excess pressure. As pressure decreases in the tank, the valve begins to close. With continuous continued heating, pressure again builds, causing the relief valve to reopen. Where flames impinge on the tank below the liquid level, the liquid absorbs the heat, allowing the tank metal to remain at a safe temperature.
That's interesting, eh?
With continued relief valve operation, the liquid level drops, exposing a greater area of the tank to the effects of heating.
That's where it goes wrong.
With the flames impinging on the vapor space of the tank, the temperature of the tank metal, uncooled by liquid, rises. At some point, due to the vapor pressure from within, the tank metal begins to weaken, stretch, and eventually tear. As the tank comes apart, large quantities of both liquid and vapor are released in a powerful explosion. The heat radiated is sufficient to ignite combustibles and cause burns great distances from the explosion.
Right, just for time constraints, I'm going to stop the video there, but I think you got the message, how it works there. So how do we unmask this enemy? We have to deploy our task forces, EFI Global. We have to do origin and cause investigations. So origin, we need to understand the area where this fire started, and in the area of origin, the point of ignition, and what are the ignition sources. We have to follow a scientific process. There are some steps involved here. We have to recognize the need for an investigation. There has to be a problem situation. We've got a fire claim. We don't know how this fire started. We need to understand how this fire started. A forensic fire investigator will do data collection, will analyze that data, and you see there's some arrows pointing in to the 3 and the 4 and the 5. Develop hypotheses. That's inductive reasoning. Then you start developing hypotheses, and that's deductive reasoning. So inductive and deductive. Step 3, 4, 5. Inductive, what is your data telling you? Step 5, now I can start drawing some conclusions. And step 7 is I select my final hypothesis. We see a lot of varying approaches. People say where the most fire mass losses occurred or most burning, that's where the fire started, or where the smoke was first seen coming out of the windows, that's where the fire started, or they heard something down the passage in the back storeroom, and then that's where the fire started. But it requires a forensic investigation. Then we do a cause investigation, so it's origin and cause. And I just want to quickly do the causation summary, and then that will be almost my closing remarks. So causation is the total sum of the conditions, the circumstances, the agencies, and the contributing factors that brought that ignition source into contact with the first material to ignite in the presence of an oxidizer and the fire spread path. So as you can see there, when we are appointed to do a fire investigation, we need to tick those boxes. I call them the triggers of causation, and we have to tick those boxes and provide insurers and our clients with the correct information about how the incident happened. A forensic investigator will take samples and have the samples analyzed with an accredited laboratory. We are truth seekers and not case makers. Can we take anything back from the enemy? Yes, waste beneficiation. And I can talk 25 minutes just on waste beneficiation. Things that have been damaged by fire. Can't just dump it. We can explore other potential uses for the materials that has been affected in a fire. And sometimes we can actually win something back for insurers. We've got a lot of case examples where we've got successful situations where we turned a loss into a profit for insurers. And us as EFI Global, we manage that process. We've got an environmental specialist team who manages the process. We work closely with the loss adjusters to work through that process of getting the site, the chemicals removed from the site. There's 3 phases. There's stop the loss and the continued contamination, remove it, clean it up, and then remediate and restore. Can we beat this enemy? Yes. We do risk assessments. We analyze the risk. It's the likelihood of something happening multiplied by the consequence. And the frequency goes up and down. So we must do risk assessments. And I think it ties up with what many of the previous speakers have said. We must learn more and be more proactive. EFI Global, we've got a proactive part that we also offer from the 4 products. Because we've seen how things go wrong. Why can't we give it back, the lessons learned, to our clients? And there we go. Don't let me start on lithium batteries, because that's another topic altogether. But if you want to talk to us, there's our emails. forensic@efiglobal.com, environmental@efiglobal.com. Philip spoke about empathy, accountability, collaboration, growth, inclusion. Those are our core values. Caring counts. Caring counts, eh?
Let's give him a big hand, ladies and gentlemen. But Johan, very, very lovely presentation. Just by show of hands, guys, who has a fire extinguisher at their home? Just by show of hands. All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, okay. I need your attention now. Who has ever had to use that fire extinguisher at home? Okay, I hope you know how to use it anyway. Now, by show of hands, who does not have a fire extinguisher at home? All right. That's the scary part, isn't it? When I saw the video of the possible fires in the homes, that scared me a bit. Because Johan talked about how it was daddy's duty to cook. I have my duties on a Sunday. But I don't have little ones around me, so that risk is minimized. I do it quite focused. And my cooking duties, I just go outside and I braai. So I keep it simple. But I think the response to that last question is a scary situation, isn't it? So I think we really need to think about this, at least having a fire extinguisher at home. Yeah. Up to the floor, any comments, contributions on that presentation? For the first time, I saw you guys with raised heads because there were videos. You like pictures, eh?
Thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question. We find that most fire claims, the fires would have happened after midnight. Between midnight and maybe 5 a.m., the guards are asleep, nobody's watching. Is that anything to do with the chemistry of fire, or is it a telltale sign of fraud? Thank you.
Just start talking.
Okay, yes. All right, so it is a very, very interesting question, and that's why we say that the forensic investigation is needed to get to the answer of that question, because you can have both. As you saw on the video there, or the photographs of the laundromat, that fire happened after hours. There was nobody in that building. The fire happened, thermodynamics happened, and the fire burned down the whole place. Yes, there are cases where people choose to intentionally set fires at times when the fire services response times might be delayed, like 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe, for instance, or when they can move on properties unseen or undetected. They come in and out and it's quiet, nobody sees them. So yes, you can actually have both of those aspects. And that's why we campaign for proper forensic fire investigations to be conducted. A proper case file needs to be compiled. All the data needs to be considered so that the correct answer can be reached for that question that you've asked there. Because insurers need to know. And I'm not a loss adjuster, but what I've learned from loss adjusting is that You can identify arson, but you still need to see whether the insured entity had a role to play with that incident. And that takes further investigation and further root cause failure analysis. We say you put the hand to the flame. So there was a flame, we see that, but which hand was attached to that flame? So it requires a forensic investigation. Oftentimes we ask Philip Thorne to assist us as well when it comes to taking of statements, talking to witnesses. But arson, lastly, I'm going to go another 25 minutes, sorry. Arson has got many factors attached to it. It's not one single thing that will tell you, oh yeah, it's arson. Therefore, when you start the investigation from the beginning, you will already start picking up indicators and contributing factors that will point out that this fire was intentionally set. I've been in the fire industry now, this December will be 40 years, and I've seen many things. I've seen many people die in fires. I've picked up many people from fires who've perished. What we've realized lately, the arsonists become more clever and more stupid at the same time, because we pick up a lot of fires where arsonists perish in that fire. They totally underestimate the substances they are using to set the fire, and there's bodies in the fire. But yeah, I hope I answered the question. It's a long answer to the short question.
Any other comments or questions from the floor? You all look and scared. I'll come to you. Do you want to just use your mic there, Mfaro?
All right. Thank you very much, Johan. I want to find out about fire retardants in those thatched houses, lodges, very common in lodges. We've got lots of them in Maputo. So normally when fire starts, those things, they are just gone. So I don't know, I know South Africa was quite ahead in using fire retardants. How effective are they in combating fire risks? Thank you.
For that question. All right, so fire retardant. So if we look at the two words, fire retardant, it means that it doesn't render the thatch roof non-combustible. It means that it will slow down the flame front from going through the thatch layer, or across the surface. But the advantage of a fire retardant on a thatch roof is two things. It slows down that surface flame spread. So if you have a fire that occurs from outside, like a veld fire and there's embers landing on the roof, right? A fire retardant will slow down the heat transfer of the ember to the thatch. It will slow it down, which means it buys us time. It buys the occupants of the building time to escape, number one. Number two, if it's a lodge like this, we can regroup, or a hotel like this. The fire team here can regroup and quickly attack that fire because they've got time. Fire retardant have bought them time. The other aspect is it also prevent the flame front from getting through the thickness of the thatch layer. Again, it buys you time. There's a lot of resistance from, I call it very carefully, from the thatch industry, because if you retro install a fire retardant on a thatch roof, they say it's very messy, they say it's very expensive, you have to penetrate the thatch layer at least by 75 millimeters. From the bottom, from the top, it's very disruptive. So there's a bit of resistance in the thatching industry. They would rather say, let's put a blanket. So if you put a blanket in the thatch layer, okay, the blanket will stop a fire from spreading inside to outside or outside to inside, but it will not stop the thatch from catching alight because it's woven into the thatch layer. So if you have a combination of a fire retardant and a thatch blanket, then you are going to beat the enemy. You have a chance. From a firefighting point of view, if a building is rectangular, the quicker you can cut a 1 meter trench across, say, the middle of the building, So fire is on the one side, and it's going to burn this whole building down. The quicker you can cross-ventilate the roof, the thatch roof, say cut a meter across, you can let that approaching flame front come to the point where the thatch ends. You save this half of the building, you lost the other half. So there's a lot of things about it, but fire retardant is definitely an advantage. It gives you that little bit of a one step ahead of the enemy. Again, a long answer to a short question.
Thank you, Johan, for the wonderful presentation. I just have one question. What sort of modern advancement that we're having in the fire prevention space? Because we see most of the systems that we have, like particularly in this country, are very reactionary. We don't have any proactive systems. Like, for example, we've got sprinkler systems. They react after a fire is already broken out. We've got fire extinguishers, the ones that were being asked here. A fire extinguisher cannot just put out a fire on its own. They need a human element for you to activate the system so that you can put out the fire. For example, I'm away from my home right now. A fire breaks out. I've got a fire extinguisher at home, but it can't work on its own. So do we have any innovative system that we have on the line that can actually maybe take out certain elements that are necessary for a fire to start without needing a person to come and intervene in the fire? Thank you.
Very nice question. It's a long question, so it's going to be a very nice long answer as well.
No, keep it short, Johan. Keep it short.
All right, so basically, if you look at fire safety and fire engineering, there are two aspects. Your passive fire protection and your active fire protection. So passive is where we use firewalls and fire-resistant separating elements, so that if a fire breaks out in one room, it will be contained to that room. Without any mechanism having to activate, it should contain the fire to that room. So if you do a probable maximum loss calculation, for instance, and your insured has got systems in place like firewalls and compartmentation, not one massive big building, but it's got smaller rooms, and there's resistance, you already have an influence on the PML calculation. So that's passive. Active is, like you've mentioned, or we've spoken earlier, you've got your sprinklers, you've got your detection system, gaseous suppression systems. Those systems needs to realize there's a fire happening in this room. It needs to trigger systems that can do the interventions without a human hand. And that is what we call active fire protection. So from an insurance point of view, we need to look at our risks from those two aspects, passive and active. Now the active. So we've got sprinklers in this room. You see the sprinkler heads here. So a sprinkler head, sprinkler systems, the technology is over 100 years old. It has saved many lives. But also often I get asked the question, the building it's a 6,000 square meter warehouse. It's got a new sprinkler system. Why is it still lying down on the ground? Why did this whole building still burn down? And one of the first things that we realize is that water that comes out of that head, there's a certain droplet size. There's a certain amount of droplets that's going to come out. There's a certain pressure and flow. So there's already 4 elements that is going to tell me whether it's going to be successful to extinguish a fire directly underneath. Now, what is the variable in that fixed? So this is fixed. It's a design system. It's installed. It's there. What is the thing that changes? The thing that changes is the fire load in this room. So if the fire load in this room changes, the heat release rate of that product that's now in this room, so it becomes a storeroom. It was a lecture room today. Tomorrow it's a storeroom. The fire load is high. So that heat energy comes out there. It will trigger the sprinkler head, but the amount of water is not enough to stop that fire in its tracks, because the fire is more powerful than the heat capacity of the water. And we call that thermal runaway, because the fire will start outrunning the activation of the sprinklers. And we're only talking on a horizontal level here at the moment. What if you've got a warehouse with racks? You've got vertical fire load. You've got horizontal floor covered from corner to corner with fire load. So if you have in-rack sprinklers to help your roof-mounted sprinklers, it's all about the response time to a fire that breaks out. Your secret
Professor?
lies in the response time.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Johan, we could go on quite a bit. I'll just allow one more question.
Is it on? Can you hear me, Johan? Very, very insightful presentation. I've known you for many years, and I know how passionate you are about your subject matter. You know that you and I have had many, many meetings in my office where you've rung me up and said, can I see you for 2 minutes? And an hour and 45, we're still busy. I just have one quick question for you. Hopefully it's not a long-winded answer, but can you please explain to us why fire engines are red?
Did you guys get that? Why are fire engines red? And this is coming from your CEO.
Okay. I need to think very carefully now. All right, so when we landed coming into Victoria Falls Airport, I saw the fire stations. I always look at a facility by its fire station. A city or a town, I look at the fire stations, you know, I have an idea. So I saw the fire engines, they were here, they were all yellow, by the way. But those fire engines, you saw the fire truck in the video. So traditionally, people used to brag with their fire engines. Cities had competitions. Back in the day, the more red and the more shiny, glittery things on it and so forth. But coming back to the fire trucks that I saw at the airport, a fire engine normally has 8 wheels. A big fire truck will have 8 wheels. You'll at least have a crew of 4. So on that fire truck. So 8 plus 4 is 12. All right? So there's 12 inches in a foot. Okay? A foot is also the length of a ruler. You know the school rulers that you get? When you go to school, they give you that ruler. But we also know that the late Queen Elizabeth was a ruler. But Queen Elizabeth was also a ship. There's a ship. And the ship sails the seas. All right? And there are fish in the seas. and the fish have fins. And during the World War, the Russians attacked the fins. And fire engines are red because they're always rushing around.
That's Professor Johan van der Heever. May I ask Board Member Bradley, for having asked that earlier long question, to come forward and present our token of appreciation. Wow, that was a long-winded answer to explain that. Awesome. Let's give them a big hand, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Johan. A very insightful presentation and quite exciting and very relevant to our own personal lives as opposed to the business side of things, isn't it?